Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Hi, and welcome back to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com with me, Paul Stevenson, on this Monday, the 6th of November, 2017. On the 14th of November, I should say, I'm going to be appearing as a guest on Renegade Radio. I had a call, or I had a message from a guy there. He does a radio show on Renegade Radio. He focuses a lot on international Jewry, Zionism, all of that type of stuff. And so I'm going to be appearing on there on, I think it's the 14th. That's going to be 1 a.m. my time. I think that's what, 8. I think it shows 8 till 10 Eastern time. So if you're a fan of the show and if you're a listener, you can tune in for that. It should be interesting to actually be on the other side of the mic as a guest rather than doing the interviews. His name is it's a difficult name to actually pronounce, but it's, as I say, it's Renegade Radio, and they seem to focus a lot on that particular area of focus that I myself focus on. So presumably, well, obviously that's why he contacted me. Is the 14th a Saturday? I don't know, is it a Saturday night? Oh, actually, it's next Tuesday. So that's next Tuesday between 8. I don't know whether I'm doing the 2 hours or 1 hour. I'll probably do anyway one, which is probably going to be 8 till 9 Eastern Standard Time, or 9 till 10 Eastern Standard Time, which is 1 o'clock my time, which is not a problem because I'm more often than not still awake and up and alert at such hours. Yeah, Richard Karol Kiewicz. Is that a Russian name? I don't know. Presumably he's American. I don't know. If you want to donate to Revolution Radio, there is a donate button there on the homepage. It's appreciated, 100% listener supported. And if you like the work I do here and you want to support that, you can do that on PayPal. You just need my email, which is Stevenson_P5@sky.com. And I have a YouTube page. It's Paul Stevenson. Again, it's Stevenson. Various interviews I've done up there, most recently with Kevin MacDonald. I've also interviewed Andrew Joyce from the Occidental Observer as well. E. Michael Jones, Jeff Gates. None of these guys avoiding the JQ. And also Gerald Celente. Who else? We got Steve Gregg and Gary DeMar would be very excellent Christian apologists who, again, you know, they don't these guys, they're not worried about being censored. These guys rely 100% on the Lord, and they don't duck arguments, and even the JQ and that type of stuff. Zionism, not scared to debunk Israel in terms of the scriptures when it's honest and required, which is pretty much everywhere, especially when it comes to this Christian Zionism and Israel being a prophecy being fulfilled in our modern day and all that stuff. So anyway, got a YouTube page there. It's just Paul Stevenson, and you can subscribe there. It's appreciated, and you can support there. Stevenson_P5@sky.com. I'm delighted to say I have Steve Gregg of The Narrow Path with me on the line. Are you back with me, Steve?
You know, I am, but I was cut off several times during the break, so I don't know how stable my connection is.
Okay, well, we'll do our best.
Okay.
I was actually going to start it, but I picked up from where I was left off, because basically, just to quickly, the media defines, I'm going to try and break this down, because the media defines the alt-right basically as neo-Nazis, white supremacists, all the rest of it. In fact, not just the alt-right, but any sort of modern conservatives who resist this far-left, socialist, progressive establishment. And but really what the alt-right boils down to, as opposed to sort of more moderate constitutionalists or even libertarians and stuff like that, is basically the recognition of the white race, the intent on the survival of the white race in the face of mass immigration and a dwindling population. This is a reality that I've looked into myself. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out. It's a reality. I mean, in the capital city in England, for example, and other cities up and down England, white people are now a minority. because we're important third world people from the third world who are having a lot more children. There's a lot of race mixing going on, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the other distinction of what would be the alt-right, as opposed to just your average conservatives, libertarians, or even your likes of Alex Jones or Paul Joseph Watts. I'm sure you've heard of these guys.
Sure.
Is the recognition of the overreaching and the overreaching arm and its destructive nature of Jewish power in the West. Those are the two main things that would really, separate the alt-right from basically any other sort of conservative right-wing movement, whether it be, online Alex Jones, Paul Watson, Mike Cernovich, or just basic, Fox News watchers.
Yeah.
So those are the two aspects of it. And as I say, when you look at the stats and you look at what immigration is doing and everything else, it's a genuine concern. It's one I share as a white man, because apart from anything else, I don't want to become a minority. I know what it's like to be among foreign cultures in London, where you feel like a foreigner in your own land. It's very disconcerting. So they want the West to remain white dominant, essentially. Now, then you add into the fact, this is where I'm going to come in with the Christian angle. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the UK today, and Christianity is the fastest declining religion. Much of this information is taken from polls and church attendance stats and mosque attendance stats. Now, what I'm wondering, and I'm erring on, I think that this alt-right movement needs more than just what it's got. I think it needs to return to what the West has traditionally had as its religion to survive. When you look,
the alt-right? The alt-right has embraced Christianity, you mean?
I think so. I think they need more than just white identity and even just recognizing and pushing back on the Jewish thing, because I think the West has become so flabby, directionless. It's preoccupied with secular levity and just silly things, which has been Islam is now filling a void because it's serious stuff.
Yeah. I don't know. I've never really done much research on the alt-right. To tell you the truth, I hear rumblings from that corner, I guess. And I don't know. I'm not that familiar with it, but just from what you've said, it does seem to me like there's not going to be any relief from the directions Western civilization's been going simply by reaffirming white identity. Because frankly, the West can survive very well with mixed races. It's the cultures that are the problem, the religious ideas. The problem in Europe, I think, is not so much that so many people are Middle Eastern, but that Middle Eastern people tend to be Muslims. And so they're bringing in a different culture and a different religion than that which has historically defined Europe and the United States. We have a similar problem here, but we don't have quite as much of the immigration issues that they have in European countries. That is, we have a lot of Middle Eastern Muslims coming into the country, but they have not overwhelmed our population yet. But they are certainly doing that in a lot of places, Germany and Britain and places like that. But again, it's hard to look at them and not think of it as a racial issue, because most of these people are predominantly of a particular geographical and racial demographic, but it's really the ideas, not the race. There are Christian Arabs and Christian Jews and Christian, Africans and Christian Asians, and, people who are Christians who share Christian values are not the problem, regardless of what their races are. It's the worldview and the religions of certain groups that's creating the problem. And it just so happens that the Muslim religion is very much, dominated to a very large degree by people of Middle Eastern extraction. So we tend to think of Middle Easterns as Muslim, and most of them probably are. But again, I wouldn't see it as a racial issue, but a worldview and religious issue.
Yeah, I see it as both myself. I guess if they were all coming here and they were Christians, it would be a lot easier. But they're not. That's the reality. Because we also have a lot of Indians here. a lot of Bangladeshis, a lot of Pakistani things. I think the fear is that the alt-right recognizes distinctions in racial groups, and the fear is becoming a minority.
I'm not sure that I would confirm that same importance of racial groups. I mean, I'm white, of course, and I live in a part of the world that's been predominantly majority white. But if gradually over time people weren't paying any attention to skin color anymore, then whether most of the people I met on the street were white or not shouldn't be an issue to me. The real issue is whether they're undermining the society or
well,
not.
they are is the problem, you see, and this is why it's particularly evident in Europe, because race, it goes beyond just someone's skin color. There's other behavioral attributes, for example. There's IQ differences, which are this gets buried by the political correct establishment. There are huge IQ differences between black people and white people and Chinese people, and between Ashkenazi Jews, for example. And it's something that I was kind of reluctant as a Christian to even look into. But you do see behavioral patterns coming from different groups coming into the West. I mean, for example, I know from living in areas of London that both Indian and Arab peoples and black peoples are way, way more ethnocentric and race conscious than white people. And they look after the interests of their own group. And when you're in a minority, which I've lived in London in those areas, they are hostile. They're hostile to other groups. Blacks are hostile to if they're competing with other groups in that area. So are the Arabs. They're particularly hostile to white groups. So I have viewed this and sort of at one point sort of reluctantly acknowledged it, but at the same time, as a Christian. And under the Christian banner, I realized that these things would not be such a problem if they were all under the same sort of cultural, ideological standpoint.
Right. You see, here's the thing. Most people are not Christians.
Exactly.
When a Chinese person or a Middle Eastern person or a black person or a Jewish person becomes a true Christian, they embrace all other Christians. If they don't, they're not really converted yet. I mean, Christ comes to change the way we think and the way we love each other and the way we value each other and to look beyond racial stereotypes. But you're correct. Since most people are not Christians, they have to have some other demographic identity.
Yeah.
And most people find it in their race. Even among white people, in a predominantly white America, there's still subgroups that identify themselves, since they're not Christian, with, whether they're surfers or they're rappers or whatever they are. I mean, there's just these subcultures, and when a large number of people of a different skin color move into a predominantly white area, and these people are not Christians, they've got to have something that they identify with larger than themselves. And of course, the most natural thing is to recognize, hey, we're outnumbered here, so we need to really look out for each other. Now, whether they did that with actual hostility toward the white hosts who have been there longer or not, I think would have to do with what kind of characters they are. But I don't, now even the difference in IQs, I haven't looked at those statistics, but just hearing it makes me think, well, that seems like it could have an awful lot to do with upbringing, because an awful lot of people in Asia really are highly pushed and motivated from their childhood to excel, and they develop their mental.
Yeah, they've done studies on that as well, where they've done experiments to test that very thing, and what they've found is basically an upscale in all groups when the conditions are what they consider to be, as perfect as can be, for example. So it basically just raises the IQ of about 5 points on every group.
Yeah.
So I mean, listen, as a Christian, by the way, I don't judge people, on their IQ. But there's also, you can get very intelligent people who are very immoral. And you can get very, unintelligent people with low IQ who are very immoral. And equally, you can get very intelligent people who are moral and very, very, simple type people who are the salt of the earth. So I'm just pointing out the differences, and that there are group differences from what research I've done. And I have looked at it, pretty extensively. But again, as you say, the biggest fear, though, really is because among the alt-right is the eradication of the white race. They feel that they have a right to survive as a race, particularly in a diverse culture where there's this diversity obsession. It seems to be a double standard that if it keeps going at the current rate, where whites are going to be a tiny minority if they survive at all. And, as a Christian, I don't actually even, I've checked this out in my heart, and I don't have any, the Lord has never convicted me of it in terms of it's an evil thing. Because presumably the white race is around because he wants it to be like every other race.
Well, maybe so, and if it is, then it won't die out. I think that for the white race to become a minority is not an impossibility. I think, frankly, on the world over, the white race is a minority. I mean, there's more people who are black, yellow, and brown than there are people who are white on the planet, and it's just that people who look a lot alike and have similar cultural backgrounds, they tend to group together in communities, and it's always nice, I should say it's always comfortable, if that community is as large as a nation, that you have a whole nation that is your community of people who have similar culture background. And I'm not sure how to maintain that in a world that's pluralistic.
Yes, but you would concede that essentially, Douglas Murray is a writer over here, wrote a book, The Strange Death of Europe, and he made a very good point. And he said, when you look at the demographics, you're right. Overall, white people are a minority, but they are still white dominant in a certain area, i.e. Europe and the West. So
Sure.
you've got China, where obviously the majority is obviously Chinese. In Africa, it's the Africans. Ostensibly, you're talking to 95% plus. So if you then make white people a minority in the only area where they are white dominant, then you're looking at a situation where, Africa can remain totally dominant black, in China and Latin America,
Right.
but whites, it's just Europe. As Douglas Murray said, it seems that Europe is there for whoever wants to claim it. And he said something like, we don't have an Africa to go to. We don't have an Israel to go to.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, listen, I didn't expect us to be on the same page with this, because I knew there was diversions. I'm pretty much on the same page with you with most things. But anyway, what I did want to talk to you about particularly was I wanted your thoughts, and what we've been talking about crosses over here as well, but it's kind of the manipulation and the distorting of Christianity for the leftist establishment, this progressive establishment, which basically, I've noticed it in certain areas, including I've seen it highlighted in the theological seminars in Christianity. There's a pastor who was arguing with me for feminism. And there was also, I saw a post that he said nationalism is a pathology and an idol. And the Bible doesn't affirm these things. And it's basically this whole idea of just like, this, it's Christianity essentially merged and blurred with the kind of the other religion of political correctness, which I think it is, and this cultural Marxism with its dogmas and doctrines of tolerance, diversity, egalitarianism, and inclusiveness, to name but a few, multiculturalism, and this progressive society. Boiling everything down to its lowest common denominator of, humanity, where you've got no distinctions made between race, culture, behaviors, and even gender or even roles, to the point where you've got this insane sort of gender relativism going on, and the dangerous doctrine, as I see it, of this major distinction reduced to a social construct, an individual choice of whether you're a boy or a girl. And I've heard people saying that, Christianity is inclusive. And Christianity affirms these things, and Christianity doesn't affirm the nation state. What is your view on those sorts of things? If you can see where I'm heading with this.
Yeah. Well, I guess I've never found my identity strictly in nationalism, but simply in Christ, and so I've never gotten really excited about those things. I think, unfortunately, many things that Christians do care about have become politicized, like the gender issues and the same-sex marriage issues. Those are things that Christians would care about as sins.
Yeah.
If they're practiced among our members in the body of Christ, those should be things that are brought under church discipline. But those things, which are really moral issues, have become very much politicized today, so that it's almost forced Christians to take a political stand about it. And I guess I've always had more. Maybe it's because I'm American, or maybe it's just because of my radical Christian views. But more than people in Europe, I've had this strong sense of separation of church and state. Not that I got from Thomas Jefferson or from any political source here, but largely from my understanding of Christ. Christ came to bring an alternative kingdom, to create an alternative kingdom. It thrives in the midst of any domicile nation, under any kind of political system. And the people who are true Christians are citizens of another country. That is, citizens of heaven. And we're strangers and pilgrims here. Now, that doesn't mean we don't accept responsibilities for our neighbor. And that might even include some political involvement, since obviously our political involvement has an impact on our neighbor. And we may, out of love for our neighbor, take a stance politically. But the Christian mentality, I believe, at least in the early church, and I think probably should be at all times, is that we are an alternative society in whatever nation we live in, and that we are serving another king, one Jesus, where we do have an interest in the fate of the nations that we live in, because our comfort, our children's freedoms, and our grandchildren's freedoms, of course, are at stake. But we also believe that all nations that are not serving Christ are ultimately serving some worldly goal that we don't stand behind. Now, I think that if Jesus were here, his views would no doubt be, I think, economically conservative. That would surprise people, because a lot of people think Jesus would be a socialist or something like that. But I don't think that Jesus believed that the government should be redistributing wealth. He did believe that Christians should be generous, and that if they have more than someone else, they should, out of their own heart, share. But that's a very different thing than socialism and than leftism. In terms of social conservative, I think Jesus would stand morally on the side of the conservatives, but I don't know that he would want to impose those morals on unbelievers through politics. Jesus never lived in a secular country, so we don't, or a pluralistic country. He lived in Israel.
Yeah, he's not a Muslim.
Right. He wasn't a Muslim, and he wasn't a pluralist. He was, he lived in Israel, in a religious nation, so he never really had to think in terms of what it's like to, or speak necessarily in terms of what it's like to be in a political pagan nation. But Paul did. The Apostle Paul, had to instruct Christians who did live under political regimes that were strictly secular. And it seems to me like he tried to encourage the church to see itself as a community of Christ, like pilgrims and strangers in the Roman Empire. So that he said that, when it comes to sins, like sexual sins, which he, in 1 Corinthians 5, lists a bunch of them, he says, we don't judge those who are outside the church about those things, but we should be judging those who are inside the church. And in my opinion, if people in the church are practicing same-sex marriage or experiencing gender dysphoria or whatever, I think that's something that Christians need to step up and say, that's simply not what God stands for. That's not what God planned, what Jesus stands for.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that I think that's going on. I think this twisting when it comes to. I'll give you an example. Recently, there was a young boy in a school in Fulham, which is a Church of England school, but it's not a state school, but it would the usual stuff. It calls itself multi-faith. And of course, you're having this inevitable, these sort of multi-faiths and these cultures come together and they clash. One will usually have to buckle and give way. So the school has a strict code, which doesn't allow long hair and dreadlocks. And the little black boy at this school came in with dreadlocks, and he was suspended. We'll get back on the other side.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. 100% listener-supported radio. Reporting the danger, unafraid. Right here, where information never sleeps. Revolution Radio.
Hi, and welcome back. I'm live with Steve Gregg. Are you online with me, Steve?
Yes, my mic is working, I think.
Okay, great. All right. So time really goes quickly, doesn't it, when you do these things?
Sure does.
I know I've got another 3 questions there that I'm just not going to be able to get time to ask you. But yeah, so this the usual stuff, this sort of clash of the rights of this child to wear dreadlocks in the school. The school's had a code for decades and centuries of tidy presentation, and dreadlocks doesn't fit it, and there's been an outrage and all the rest of it. And the usual machine is kicked into gear about discrimination against blacks and minorities and stuff, and we want justice for Chikazee. When do we want it now? And all the rest of it. But then there was a woman from a director of the board of directors, called into a radio show with a scathing attack on the school and said, school calls itself apparently a Church of England. Well, it's not very consistent with the Christian values and principles of tolerance and inclusion. And it really got my back up, because I think it's just, my concern is that this misrepresentation of Christianity for just more nefarious purposes and political purposes, and et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we see this in the church, this misrepresentation of Christianity as well, sadly, in the modern church, as you would affirm, I'm sure. My question is, how inclusive is Christianity? My contention is, it's not that inclusive if you look through the scriptures. I mean, it's
Well, inclusive could mean one of two things. It could mean, in many of the Christian commentaries and so forth, it talks about how inclusive Christianity means that anyone can become a Christian.
Exactly.
As opposed to the old Jewish notion that only the Jews were God's people. Christianity is inclusive of all races and nations that want to become Christians. That's not the same thing as we're saying that our institutions, let's say our Christian schools, also want to affirm and include religions that are contrary to Christianity. Now, I don't know anything about this kid with the dreadlocks. I mean, it's possible he was Rastafarian. I don't know.
Yes,
was it? But if someone wants to go to a privately owned school, let's say a Muslim school, if I lived in a country where most of the better schools were run by Muslims and they had Muslim policies and so forth, I wouldn't send my kid to school with a ham sandwich. I just wouldn't do. If I want my kid to participate, they participate in submission to the policies of the school
to meet the conditions.
If I don't want my kid to cut his dreadlocks off, and then I won't send him to a school that has a code against that. That's the parent's prerogative, but it's not their prerogative to require the school to change their standards.
Well, that is the pressure, and that's why I was like sort of drawing a parallel, because apparently it's the lady who called in to make these points, and others have been making similar points. They also don't realize that there are conditions to be met in Christianity. It's not that inclusive in that regard. If you look, I mean, as you say, unlike Judaism, I suppose, or whatever you want to call it, the Old Testament, Israel, and the way they view things, anybody can come. But you don't come on your terms is the point. Right.
Well, that's right. And you don't come and tell Christianity what it must change in order to accept you. You come to God, or you don't, on his terms, or you don't come at all. And if God says, okay, you need to repent and follow Christ, then that's what you have to do. Now, coming to a Christian school isn't the same thing as coming to Christianity.
No, I understand, yeah.
Because coming to a Christian school, a school might have a policy that they do allow a certain percentage of people in who are not Christians, and they hope to maybe evangelize them in that context. But also, if a Christian school says, no, this is for Christian children, and we're going to follow Christian ways, and we're going to have, we're going to study the Bible here, and here's our standards that our founders and directors uphold. Or even if it's not a Christian school, I mean, frankly, a Christian school is a private enterprise, I would imagine. But if somebody was not a Christian, started an atheist school, and they only allowed atheists to come in, and they wouldn't let people bring a Bible there, I'd say, well, if it's their own school, let them make their own policies. No one has to send their child to a school that they don't want to. It's sort of like those who want to censor talk radio. They say, well, people are only hearing the conservative side on American talk radio, and they need to hear the liberal side too. Well, of course, it's kind of a silly thing to say since all the mainstream media is all liberal. But the point is, no one has to listen to talk radio if they object to the political slant of it. No one has to join a club or go to a school or do any of those things if they don't like the religious or political or cultural demands that go with being there. I believe in private enterprise, and if a school is a Christian school and it's not a government school, then I would say that nobody should be able to come in and say, well, you've got to accept me the way I am.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I don't want to happen, because as I say, then you have these culture clashes, and then you have one culture is going to have to buckle and give way to another. And again, I just feel that when it's in a country who's had their culture and their norms for so long, why should they be the one to buckle? I mean, it's probably, I probably feel more affected by it because I've seen London than where you are, probably, because when I didn't live in London, I wasn't affected by it as much, but I've experienced more of it here, and it just always feels that just everyone's complaining all the time about how evil Western culture is, and white people, and how racist they are. And this is the other point I want to get to. I want this is something that I feel the Christian church has been, and both institutional church, if you like, both of the Catholic Church and larger Protestant church, is the idea that mass immigration is our charitable duty, and that we deserve it anyway because of the evil British Empire and the history of slavery in the US, and this type of narrative where there's like a lot of guilt being induced en masse for, well, I would call it pathological altruism, to be honest. And again, this is not conducted strictly by Christians. You've got huge amounts of huge swathes of our population here, which are far left, sort of liberal, progressive types. But just that point, where it's just like it's our Christian duty. What I'm trying to, I'm wrestling with it myself, and I'm glad we've had this conversation. It's just to, I want to really sort of know what the Bible says on such things, if it says anything on them, and even though we affirm that Christianity is, a separate spiritual nation, which can be anywhere, whether it's in Hong Kong or whether it's in Rio or whether it's where you are, where I am, but it doesn't negate, from what I can see, the nation state either. And I see things like this twisting where I think Christians in their better nature are being manipulated to facilitate mass immigration and that type of thing. And it concerns me, because I'm not sure it's actually it's God's will, and I think it may well be Satan's will.
Well, yeah, I think it could very well be. See, I don't believe that any nation has Christian obligations, because no nation is really Christian. I believe that Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. There's two different spheres. God's interests have to do with the moral and spiritual conduct of people. The nation's interests, Caesar's interests, have to do with the political safety and cohesion of its society. Now, of course, Christianity can inform the state, and has in Western Europe has done so for many centuries. But we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that the state has to act like a Christian. The state is a secular political institution. It has to make its decisions made on the basis of what's good for the citizenry. The church is to make decisions on the basis of what is moral and right for its own adherents, that is, its own members to do. The church might tell the people outside, the church might tell the non-Christians, Christ stands for such and such. And if you become a real Christian, if you come into his kingdom, you're going to have to stand for these things with him. But we're not going to tell the nation of non-Christians that they have to behave like Christians. unless they want to become Christian.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I would never attempt to, to do that or to affirm that as something that is,
What I'm saying is, when people try to say, well, it's the Christian duty to be inclusive of all these immigrants, the nation doesn't have a Christian duty because it's not a Christian nation. It's a nation that is pragmatic.
Yeah.
And these immigrants, if it's not good for the integrity and the security of the nation to have all these immigrants coming in, then the nation is not under no Christian obligation to act like it's the church. It's not the church.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I was just, as I say, the whole idea that of this blurring. You see, this global sort of socialist nation state hating citizen of nowhere is dangerous. You see with the EU, then you have an unelected bureaucratic system just ruling over all sorts of nations, taking away the sovereignty of nations, which I'm opposed to. I mean, what I'm trying to say is, I mean, from what I understand, if you look at passages like, even Christ in his Great Commission, and he said, "Go and make disciples of all nations." What I'm saying is, from reading the Gospels, I don't see anywhere in there where Jesus, eradicates the whole idea of the nation state as a bad thing.
No, he didn't. That's why he said, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's."
Yeah.
And Paul also said that the nation state and its officials are God's ministers.
Exactly.
For maintaining justice and security of its citizens. Again, that's a different role than what the church as a community has, but the state that Paul was talking about was a totally pagan state. Nero, when Paul wrote Romans 13, Nero, who was a very wicked pagan, was the emperor, and the people in the Senate in Rome were not Christians either.
No.
Most of the governors were not Christians, hardly anywhere, and yet Paul said that institution had an obligation before God to maintain the safety of innocent people. And that's basically what the state is for. And God has a right to require that of the states. But what he requires of pagans is different than what he expects of Christians. Of course, pagans should become Christians, and then they should do what God requires of Christians. But while they are in their pagan state, God hasn't given us the obligation to civilize or Christianize the unbelievers. Our role is to make real Christians out of them, and then Christianize them, then disciple them, I think. And so, I mean, the nation state has validity in its place, and Christians should support it insofar as they can, and should recognize that the state may have to take a hard position about people that the church might not be inclined to take a hard position about, because the church, we accept broken people who are in need. I mean, the church is commanded to be charitable. The nation is not. The poor should not necessarily be seeking their support and everything from their government. But in the church, Christians should seek support when they need it from their fellow Christians. It's an alternative community.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm agreeing with you. I think Britain is and many European countries are acting very foolishly and simply allowing such an overrun of people of a different culture who don't want to assimilate. See, the United States was always referred to as the great melting pot because so many different cultures were allowed to come here. But in previous generations, they actually melted. They actually blended. They actually adopted Christian, I should say, I won't say Christian, I'll say American values. They wanted to come here and be Americans. And I'm not saying that people being Americans is a necessary thing, but if you're going to live in America and be a citizen of America, you should be an American. And yet, of course, what we have now is people from many cultures coming, and they're not melting. They're not blending.
It's because their numbers are so big, and the welfare state and stuff like that. It's the same here. It gives them no incentive. They can survive quite well. They don't even have to speak the English. There's so many of them, and they think, well, why should we assimilate?
Yeah, and I think the Western nations are living with sort of a false guilt about, like you say, slavery in the past, and our relative success. I mean, the Western society has been far more successful in imperialism, in exploration, in invention, in economics than most of the rest of the world has been. And the rest of the world is trying to make us feel guilty that we happen to do things in a way that led to those kinds of benefits.
Well, yeah, and they conveniently ignore in their narrative that the evil British Empire went to tremendous lengths and cost to actually end slavery.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it was the white British who were doing that.
Yeah, and the other irony, of course, is there's a lot of black slave trading and human trafficking going on today. For shipping them across the Mediterranean there, to meet NGOs who are, I think, addicted to their righteous nature, and just ignore the fact that there's human trafficking going on by blacks. There's huge operations of human trafficking going on, bringing people from Africa across the Mediterranean there into Italy and then right up through Europe. And the reason I think it is not a good thing is because the crime has shot up, and there's a rape epidemic at the minute going through Europe. Rapes are shooting through the roof. I mean, there was a girl in Tower Hamlets, which is a borough in East London, last week, raped on 3 separate occasions in that area. And they conveniently ignore from the narrative that it is one of the biggest Muslim populations in the UK, with 40 mosques down there. And this girl got raped on 3 separate occasions by 3 different people down there.
Well, that's because Islam does not condemn rape. Muhammad himself raped women, and he's the model for Sharia. I mean, people who want to make Islam out to be a religion and a culture that can live happily alongside Western civilization without any modification, they simply have no idea what Islam teaches and what Islam stands for.
Yeah.
And of course, the people who are immigrating are not always telling their culture.
Why would they?
Right.
But
Western culture and Sharia law can never coexist.
No, you're right. They cannot. I mean, they're diametrically opposed to each other, and you're seeing this clash happening all the time, and they just don't work. But you mentioned there actually about the success of the West and economics and stuff like that. When I was down at the Metropolitan Tabernacle seminar earlier in the year, there's a wonderful book actually by an Indian gentleman, Vishal Mangalwadi. It's called The Book That Made Your World, How the Bible Created the Soul of Western Civilization. And my contention is that the reason that the West has flourished so much has been because of Christianity. It includes a chapter in here, by the way, which would be very controversial, but he should know because he comes from India, saying that the reason that the third world in no small part suffers from poverty is because of lower moral standards and corruption. You can't brand everyone with the same brush, but it's an interesting point, and I think that the West has thrived. And I do wonder if it's actually under a bit of judgment now. So if a Christian friend of mine earlier thought that maybe
Paul, I actually have thought that for years. I've actually thought the reason we're losing our society is because we lost our faith as a nation. And, we lost our faith back in the early 20th century. And then we lost marriage in the 60s. In 1960s, we lost marriage with no-fault divorce. And we've lost it further with the total redefinition of marriage to not mean anything resembling what it is. And now we're even losing our normal gender identity recognition. I mean, it's like there's a fog of stupidity that is coming on us that almost seems to be impossible without some supernatural explanation. I mean, human beings are not usually that stupid, but I think there is a judgment.
If you look back, I mean, it's maybe the third and fourth generations get it, but and that would probably, when you look at the timeline, it's probably overdue. But it's incredible. The way things have gotten, as you say, even with the gender thing. I was never, someone who subscribed to any of the Calvinist doctrines, but I think I'm getting very close to affirming total depravity, Steve. Because it just they never seem to stop. It just seems to go on and go on.
Well, you don't have to be a Calvinist to believe that there are some people who are absolutely depraved. It's just that the not everybody. See, a Calvinist would say that everybody who's not a Christian is totally depraved, and people who aren't Christians who are not totally depraved, but there are plenty of people, and an increasing number, who are totally depraved because, as it says in Romans chapter 1, they did not desire to retain God in their knowledge, and therefore God gave them over to reprobate minds.
Well, in the case of children, what chance do they have? Because this stuff has been, they're getting indoctrinated and brainwashed by this stuff, and it's a terrible injustice. And of course, it creates a very unstable society when people can't even feel sure about their gender.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett have said, and Sam Harris have said that to teach children Christianity is child abuse, and yet, who's speaking out against people allowing their little boys to think they're little girls, and even allowing them to go through the beginnings of gender transition? I mean, if that's not child abuse.
Yeah, well, God has a funny way of changing people's minds, because Dawkins and other homosexuals, they're not so hard on Christianity now, because it doesn't affirm throwing them off buildings.
Yeah.
So they're coming around a little bit now, and they're starting to say, well, maybe Christianity wasn't as bad as we thought. We've got Islam to contend with. But equally, I was saying to my friend, if there is a turnaround, we might not be able to see it because you think it's an irrevocable alteration of the demographics and the culture. But if there's a turnaround, God can supernaturally turn the situation around if he wants to.
Yeah, but what it would take is for people to embrace God and truth again, because when people give up truth, they embrace any lie.
I know, and I feel on a little bit of a mission to try and get the message across that Christianity, the West has been blessed in no small part, as that book outlines, by Christianity, and I think it's going to need a turn to the Lord again to have to be successful in what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Steve, we're out of time, but it was great to talk to you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Good to talk to you, Paul.
All right, cheers.
Bye.